Greetings, my fellow Americans, and welcome to another episode of the Great Montana Conspiracy Podcast. I'm your host, Ron Glick. Tonight we're going to be talking about partisanship, or specifically the party system that exists here in the United States. But before we get started on that tonight, if you would take the time to please like and subscribe to this video, and of course share it with your friends and family. Do your best, regardless of which platform you take it on, whether you're watching this on YouTube, where most of my activity is, or whether you're watching it on some other platform that gets distributed to. By all means, please take the time to like, subscribe, or whatever variation the platform you're watching on this allows. And of course, as I said, share it. Now, as always, if you cannot read the text attached to this video, if for some reason you're watching this video is just isolated all by itself, feel free to visit us on monspiracy.podbean.com, which is where this podcast originates. Now, as I said, today we're going to be talking about party politics, and likely it's going to sound like I'm getting pretty political, but I want to stay right up front before anybody else has a chance to see something, take it out of context. People will still probably take it out of context, but before anyone has a chance to do that, let me make it very clear. I do not believe in the party political system. I believe the party political system should be outlawed. I do not subscribe to any party. I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm not an independent party. I am a person who is non-party affiliated. I do not believe in subscribing to the belief of a political platform. I do not believe in voting for someone for the sake of their associations outside of government. I look at people, their record, what they stand for, what they say, whether it's credible, whether it's truthful, and I make my judgments based off that. Doesn't mean I'm always going to choose the right candidate, but it means I'm going to make an informed decision. And that's what I've always encouraged everyone to do. With that being said, I am going to be talking about the Democrats and the Republicans. I'm going to be talking about specific actions of both parties and the history of where these parties came from and the political divisions that currently exist in the United States, and more specifically, how those partisan politics actually allow corrupt organizations like the Great Montana Conspiracy to exist and to hide from public scrutiny. Now, this week I was sent an article. It was published by NBC Montana, and there's been, of course, it was covered by several different agencies. But specifically, it was talking about how the Montana Attorney General, Austin Knudsen, had called out the Supreme Court. Okay, the title of the article said, Montana Attorney General calls out the Montana Supreme Court. Hey, this sounds like it'd be right up my alley, right? Here's the state Montana Attorney General calling out corruption in the state, and especially in the political system, and in a court system, a judiciary, I have long criticized. I believe I was supposed to see this as seeing that the Attorney General was on the side of exposing corruption. I've done quite a few podcasts on the corruption of the Montana judiciary. I have openly challenged the corruption that exists inside the Montana Supreme Court. I've called out multiple issues against Chief Justice Mike McGrath. I've challenged the integrity of the Bar Association, the Judicial Standards Commissions, etc., these sub-agencies that exist under the scope and power of the Montana Supreme Court. In a nutshell, this kind of headline sounds promising. It sounds like it's, oh hey, people are waking up, they're going to see. I really wish that was what was going on. The problem is the title does not actually reflect the content of the article. A little background for what's going on here. Knudsen was the keynote speaker at a Republican fundraising event. While he was speaking, essentially Knudsen presented a party line campaign speech. He talked about drugs in Montana, vaccine mandates, which of course Republicans are opposed to, and ongoing litigations. But then he claimed to attack the Montana Supreme Court. But what he was really doing was he just used this as a platform. He attacked two judges specifically, Ingrid Gustafson and Jim Rice, who were up for re-election. He specifically called out Gustafson as a hardcore leftist. Make no mistake, this was a political attack. This was not calling out corruption in the state. This was not attacking judiciary misconduct. This was a political attack. This was an attack from a Republican against somebody who had Democratic leanings, who was sitting on the Montana Supreme Court. And again, make no mistake, the Montana Supreme Court is a very Republican-dominated court because the head justice is Republican, Mike McGrath. Despite the fact that judicial officers are supposed to be nonpartisan, The truth of the matter is, Mike McGrath was a Republican Attorney General. He always ran on a Republican ticket before he became a judge. He is very Republican in his decisions. He defends big business. He defends large organizations. He shoots down individual civil liberties and believes in a larger, stronger, centralized government. Of course, he believes that centralized government should be the judiciary. He has openly said, and I've pointed it out in previous podcasts, that he believes that Montana's independent judiciary somehow makes for a better government. No, it gives one branch of government absolute power over everything else, creates a monarchy, and puts him at the head of it because he's the Chief Justice. So no, it doesn't create more balance or protection. He actually said that citizen oversight would kill democracy. This is what Mike McGrath has said. These are his words. Because he believes citizen oversight of the judiciary would destroy democracy, because his independent judiciary is the sole line of defense against the collapse of democracy. No. Independent judiciary would mean that it's not answerable to either other branch of government. That is not going to somehow protect and shelter Montana, the citizens, anyone. It's certainly not going to protect democracy. It's going to create a monarchy. It's going to create an elitist organization within the government that runs the whole shebang. That's what he believes he's running. That's what he wants. That's what he calls for. That's what he told the Legislative Investigative Committee that he met just a few months ago. So, as I said, make no mistake, what was going on here, Knudsen was attacking members of the Montana Supreme Court, not because the Montana Supreme Court was out of control, not because the Montana Supreme Court was breaking laws or being unconstitutional or defending a corrupt good old boy network within the state of Montana, or otherwise known as the Great Montana Conspiracy. No, he was calling them out because these particular judges were less lined up with some of the positions he wanted to pursue, like vaccinations, like, Republican deadline issues about anything that comes from, whether it be big business or whatever. Now keep in mind, while on the court, these judges have sided almost universally with Mike McGrath. Jim Rice has specifically. In many cases, in judicial orders I've seen, Jim Rice signs right alongside Mike McGrath. But they have a history of being liberal, or not, of being, instead of being conservative. So as a consequence, he sees an opportunity to although these people are party players, they play along, they do what the party line, which in this case is the Great Montana Conspiracy, or the Good Old Boy Network, whatever you want to call it, they're party players towards keeping that institution in place. They nevertheless represent ideologies that are not quite in line with the things Republicans want, so they become easy candidates. So he's not really attacking the Montana Supreme Court. He's simply going on a campaign speech to try to downplay two candidates that are running for re-election so he can possibly have them replace the people who are more in line with his political ideology. Okay, so make no mistake, that is what he's doing. He's not attacking the Montana Supreme Court. He's going after implanting people who are more politically aligned with whatever his own agenda, or in this case, the agenda of the Republicans happens to be. But by doing this, what he's doing is he's deflecting attention away from the actual issues, deflecting attention away from the corruption of the Montana Supreme Court, and focusing on political grandstanding of party politics. By hiding behind party politics, he actually hides the existence and downplays the corruption aspects of the Montana Supreme Court. So he's not actually calling out the corruption, he's hiding the corruption behind this smokescreen of political grandstanding and party politics. And that's how the Great Montana Conspiracy hides, because it becomes something that is easier to hide behind if no one is paying attention or looking for that, because they see it as just party politics as usual. This had nothing to do with whether the Montana Supreme Court was corrupt. Nothing to do with Mike McGrath. Nothing to do with the fact how all 7 justices voted on a Sunday to invalidate the legislative subpoenas. Nothing to do with the overreach or assertment of other government powers. Nothing to do with McGrath claiming his judiciary is independent. It was only a launching point for a political attack against judges running for re-election. And even that is more just smokescreen than any actual effective issue. He's fundraising for Republicans, so he's going to talk about Republican issues, and he needs to be able to attack Democratic opponents to raise money for Republican issues. Even though the judicial officers are supposed to be nonpartisan, let's face it, you have liberal and you have conservative. These are judges with liberal histories, and therefore they become easy targets when he's talking to a group of people trying to raise money for Republicans. Party politics. An AG spokesperson told NBC Montana, quote, "The Supreme Court has been politicized for a long time. Although judges don't appear on the ballot with a party label, the majority of Montana's judges' campaigns are heavily funded by Democratic trial lawyers and associated political groups. Also, a plurality of Montana judges currently on the bench were appointed by Democratic governors." Okay, let me break this down. This is a perfect example of political grandstanding, political propaganda. Let me break it down. The Montana Supreme Court has not been politicized as much as it's gone rogue. It's off the rails, ladies and gentlemen. It's not politicized. Mike McGrath thinks he's running an independent judiciary that is not answerable to any other branch of government, and he should be let to be run autonomous to do whatever he wants. He gets to determine whether things are legal, gets to determine who the judges are, gets to determine everything. Every aspect of law he controls. Every aspect of government appointment he controls. That's what he wants, and that's what he believes he has. This isn't a matter of being politicized. This is a matter of being a completely rogue agency, a rogue branch of government that's just completely usurped powers of the other two branches and tried to just step away from any control or oversight, regardless of whether it be other government branches or citizen oversight. So it's not about it becoming politicized. It's about it being completely out of control, being unconstitutional. And where it has gone political, it actually supports Republican agendas, not Democratic agendas. And that's because Mike McGrath is the Chief Justice, and Mike McGrath is a die-hard Republican. And I don't say that to be divisive. I'm saying that's what his allegiance is to Democratic platforms, to big business, to big money, to decentralizing or empowering the government and removing the powers of the people, decentralizing the local powers and empowering his own court. Most judges are not actually supported by big businesses, by the way. They're supported by, or I should say, most judges are not supported by Democratic interests, they're supported by big businesses, they're supported by landowners and wealthy individuals who are typically Republican candidates or Republican ideals and supporters, not Democrats. Montana has always been a red state. And until this year, judicial appointments were controlled by the Montana Supreme Court. So to say the appointments were made by Democratic governors is misinformation. Because until this year, until the legislature actually changed the law, the Montana Supreme Court's Chief Justice created a list. Well, they have a committee, and the committee submits it to the Chief Justice, and he approves it, and blah, blah, blah. There's a Republican, conservative-minded individual submitting a list of potential judges to the governor to choose from. They may have been Democratic selection out of the last batch, but they were Republican selected, which means that they were all conservative-leaning judges, and the governor was left to choose from whatever he was given. If the Montana Supreme Court wanted conservative judges, they got conservative judges because they were only names given to the governor to choose from. So make no mistake, the governor may have been the one appointing and making the final choice. And if he was a Democratic governor, the Democratic governor made the selection, but he made a choice from conservative judges because that is what the Montana Supreme Court gave him. So don't sit here and listen to that, because that is just complete bullarchy. There's no truth to it, other than the fact that, yes, he did actually make the appointments. If we're looking at Bullock, the last Democratic governor, and Schweitzer before him. But let's face it, and this is the big point, they didn't choose the candidates, the list of candidates from which the names were drawn. The Montana Supreme Court did. And that has been a Republican-controlled, conservative-controlled organization for as long as I've been in Montana. And I've been in Montana since '96. So just so you're aware, that is complete misinformation. It's complete inaccurate because it's incomplete. Remember, I've talked many times about taking things out of context and providing only partial information. I use the example. For instance, this is a blue and white shirt. To say it's a blue shirt or to say it's a white shirt is incomplete. It's not a white shirt. It has white lettering, but it's not a white shirt. Likewise, to say it's a blue shirt only, ignoring the white lettering, is also untrue. It's also incomplete. The inaccuracy of the information makes it a false statement, especially if it's known. Now, if you're seeing this from behind, ladies and gentlemen, it's blue all the way in the back. So if you're seeing it from behind, you might say it's a blue t-shirt. But if you're looking at it head on, you see white lettering. So it's a blue and white t-shirt. That's the complete truth. But to tell his constituents, to tell this Republican gathering, or for this matter, for the AG to make a public statement that says that these are appointed by Democratic governors, is like calling this a white t-shirt. Because this is the smallest portion of coloring on the t-shirt. And the governor's choice of the final judicial person to fill a vacancy of the district court judges, that's the smallest amount of the selection process. If you get a list of 5 conservative judges, you can't add a liberal judge or a Democratic-leaning judge to your choices. You are left with whatever the Montana Supreme Court gives you. So to sit here and say that the Democratic governors are responsible somehow for these appointments is misinformation and misleading. The final selection may have been the governors, but the list comes from McGrath, and it comes from Republican-controlled and dominated Supreme Court. It just does. Knudsen was not against the Montana Supreme Court when he was making the speech. It was about electing politically aligned judges. At the very least. At most, it was just about just playing to the ears of the listeners to encourage funding for the Republican Party and Republican elections of people like himself. Lest we forget, and remember this point, all 7 judges joined McGrath's campaign to shut down the legislative power of oversight of the Montana Supreme Court. They signed this order on a Sunday outside working hours so that when Monday came, the power of the subpoenas would be quashed. They took the extraordinary task, all 7 of them, to come in and support an unconstitutional act of suppressing oversight against their branch of government. So regardless of what their leaning may be politically, they are all in support of the corrupt organization that is the Great Montana Conspiracy. They are all in choice and empowered over the idea that the Montana judiciary answers to no one else. They support the corruption. They support the unconstitutional actions. So never let it be forgotten that regardless of what political parties they ally themselves with, their true loyalty is to the Montana corruption, to the Good Old Boy Network, to the Great Montana Conspiracy. Keep that in mind when you consider their allegiances to pre-existing parties. Now I'm going to talk about the political divisions, and remember, this is how these people hide. This is how the Great Montana Conspiracy hides itself. It hides behind the public perception that it's all politics. It's all party politics. But as you saw, and as I just pointed out, when all 7 justices signed a unanimous order on a Sunday to quash the oversight power of the legislature against their branch of government, that's not politics. That's not party politics. That is corruption. That is the Great Montana Conspiracy at work. And it was a very rare public spectacle of it. So the article sent to me, it did not achieve the desired result. It did not get me to think, oh, great, the Attorney General's on our side. I wish it did. When you see all 7 judges, not 2, all 7, back a politically corrupt aspect. It's not about party politics. It's not about partisan reasons. It is about corruption. And when I see an agent of the Montana government not calling out that corruption and that issue I don't see an ally. I see somebody using party politics as a smokescreen to deflect and turn attention away from the real issues. And that can only be a player in the Great Montana Conspiracy, acting and using their position, abusing the information they provide by keeping critical information hidden and under the wraps, or deflected away from by focusing on things that his listeners want to listen to. This article did not get me to see Knutson as an ally, but it did make me realize that what I really needed to talk about was partisanship. Specifically, how divisions created by party players and party politics helped create the Great Montana Conspiracy, and how the acceptance of party politics by the people at large helps keep the citizens from actually looking and seeing it for what it is. And that's where we're going to focus tonight. Now, before we can talk about how this affects Montana specifically, we really need to understand how this came to be in the United States. In the U.S., in the United States of America, for anyone watching this outside our country, people will say we have a party-based government. Specifically, we have a two-party controlled government. The problem is we don't. The United States Constitution has nothing about political parties. There's nowhere in the Constitution to provide for political parties. In fact, our first president, George Washington, had no political party. In fact, he spoke out against political parties. Political parties instead used their influence to gain power and influence within government, and then had laws written to legalize what they had done. But at no point has the Constitution ever been amended or incorporated to allow for party politics. Therefore, the party politicization of the United States government is not a constitutional function of our government. It is the existence of extra powerful groups, extraordinary groups that exist beyond the scope of government, that in fact control government. Let me make that clear. This is in itself its own form of conspiracy. It is groups of people allied along political ideals who use their money and influence, much like Knutson did with the fundraising event, to gain money, to gain power, to put their own people in places of power and influence within the government, and then control the government, depending upon if they can get the members to do so. Political parties have used their influence also since the beginning of our country, but not from the beginning of it. The founders neither anticipated nor planned for party politics in the United States. And in fact, the people who actually formed the first political parties were actually opposed to the formation of political parties themselves when they were writing papers in support of the independence of America and the American Revolution. George Washington opposed party politics and spoke out about it quite frequently during his tenure in his 2 terms as president. And he spoke about it even after he left office. He believed America would be destroyed by divisions with political parties. He called for unity, not division, as parties began to emerge. In his farewell address in 1796, George Washington specifically spoke against party politics. His words, "The spirit of party serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riots and insurrections." Riot and insurrection, singular in both of those. Until his death in 1799, George Washington argued against party politics. He believed the country could and should function without political parties. He called partisan politics political disunity. He's not wrong. These were truly inaccurate statements. They were, ironically, for a military general who really didn't have a whole lot of political ideals, political background or experience. The man had some insights. Historically, party politics started in the U.S. around 1793 to 1794. Now keep in mind, the United States Constitution was signed in 1787. This is not very far into the young years of our country. Idealized by the rivalry between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, groups began to form. We had groups that were called, not officially parties at this point in time, but we had Federalist believers, people who believed in a central government, empowering a central government, and we had those that were against federalism. Federalism being those that felt that a central government would create another monarchy, would create another power that would hold and lord its power over the citizens of the country. So the Federalists, the people who believed in federalism, believed in a strong central federal government, while the people who were opposed to federalism were the ones who believed in the powers of the states and the citizens and the people. Groups calling themselves the Democratic Republican Societies began to form in and around 1793. Between 1793 and 1796, there were 40 groups scattered across our fledgling country. Not all share the same name, but usually had Democratic or Republican in their name, in their titles. These clubs or societies stated their primary mission was to protect against government corruption and disseminate political knowledge. In other words, take the information about government and its operations and share it with the people, and protect against political corruption by creating an element of transparency. Though claiming to be nonpartisan, they were frequently called a faction by opponents, people who did not like what they were doing. And in truth, they sort of were, because they were acting against the Federalist idea. These Democratic Republican societies were actually working against federalism by trying to give people, normal people, working people, people who would otherwise not have influence over government, information about what was going on. It would take information and power away from the federal core and share it with the states. So although they technically were not a partisan group, they did actually practice against the Federalist ideal, which made them a faction. These societies actually ended up fomenting a rebellion against a federal tax on whiskey. It was called the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. These societies came out in support of the French Revolution. They spoke about the rise of the poor, which was about the rising of the poor overthrowing the rich, or the elite monarchy of France. They stood in direct opposition to federal politicians who believed in the strength of the federal government. So yeah, they had partisan politics. They were not, maybe they called themselves nonpartisan. They were not even a desire to be partisan. They nevertheless did work against the ideals of a centralized federal government, which made them, by de facto, partisan, even if they weren't trying to be. In the case of the Whiskey Rebellion, the insurrection in Pennsylvania actually required George Washington to lead the militia, the United States militia, down to Pennsylvania to quell the uprising. And this is all because Alexander Hamilton decided to build up the strength of the federal government. Federalism. He wanted to impose what he considered a moderate tax on whiskey. Only it was not well received in Pennsylvania. And the societies were blamed for sharing this information and raising dissent against it. And it led to a rebellion, an uprising. Now, the word of the militia being on its way, they all split and they took to the winds. So there was no battle to be fought. The rebellion was quashed just by the threat of the militia coming down. But still, 150 men were actually located and convicted of treason because they rose up against the payment of this tax by the Central Federalist government. The influence of the societies were responsible. But even though the rebellion kind of took the society's ideas and actually kind of created a temporary insurrection, it represented a danger, and Washington saw it for what it was. The influence of society started to diminish after this, and Washington certainly blamed them for the separatist thinking and the disunity created by that. But their power remained, and their impact remained. Washington considered these societies a vanguard of things to come. In 1796, he actually warned that the societies would interfere with the electoral, he feared they would interfere with the electoral process. Specifically, he warned the societies were likely, quote, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to assert for themselves the reins of government. George Washington, feared political parties would create conflict and stagnation in government. And he was not wrong. The societies themselves dissolved by the end of the century, but they set the foundation for the formation of the Democratic Republican Party. Originally, it was named the Anti-Federalist Party. It was formed in opposition to the Federalist Party, which was heralded and championed by Alexander Hamilton, who once again believed in the centralization of the empowerment of a central federal government. It gained such members, the Democratic Republican Party gained such members as Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, who became central figureheads for this party. And they believe in decentralizing the government power to give more power to the people and to the states. And they believe the Federalists were trying to restore monarchy in the U.S. Remember that in the American Revolution, there was a big fear of getting a new king. They didn't want a new king. They wanted democracy. They wanted something ruled by the people. So Thomas Jefferson was one of those people that stood up, and James Madison were people who stood up and said, we need to preserve the power of the states. Well, Alexander Hamilton believed that the government could not exist without a strong central government. And I'm not judging either side of the argument, but I do feel that they both had good elements in what they wanted. I think both could have existed simultaneously as George Washington wanted them to coexist. Instead, they developed rivalries and jealousies, just as Washington predicted, which ended up the creation of party politics that have evolved into the modern day. Opponents of the Federalist policies, example, feared that they would be empowering the rich over the poor, and they're, again, not wrong. Just as Federalists believed that decentralizing government power and giving more power to the people would somehow increase control over federal government. Again, they weren't wrong. So they both had good arguments and good issues about their background and their support. But when they decided to take the different camps rather than try to stay in the same camp, it led to what we have today. So the parties themselves have splintered and reformed through our history, about 7 or 8 evolutions, to be honest. The two-party system has largely dominated American politics, and more specifically, the control of government. We've evolved today into the Republicans and the Democrats, and that's where our two-party system currently exists. Now, incidentally, I should mention that America has over 100 registered political parties. However, there's only 2 recognized national political parties, Republicans and Democrats. We have political primaries for Democratic primaries or Republican primaries. And if you want to vote in either one of those elections, you must declare yourself Democratic or Republican. You can't go into a Democratic primary and call yourself a libertarian or a communist or a federalist or whatever other title your political party wants to call themselves. You have to take a Democratic or a Republican primary ballot. Like, once again, the Constitution does not provide for this. This is not something the Constitution allows. This is not something the Constitution says should happen. This is not the process of government as laid out by our central governing document. These are laws that were passed once the political parties gained influence over government and could control government as extraordinary, extra powerful, extra independent organizations that existed outside and beyond government that actually controlled government. It's called interested parties when it comes to things like nonprofits or things like that, but it's essentially the same process. These are people who have no true empowerment. I mean, they have laws and regulations that have been, certain passed over to control their organization and make their organizations legal. Well, the truth is, at the end of the day, no one tells Democrats what to do when running government, and no one tells Republicans what to do when running government. And the individuals who call themselves Democrats and the individuals who call themselves Republicans do not work for the American people. They work for their parties. And that's where we are today. George Washington predicted it, and it's definitely come to pass. Party politics have left America fractured and divided. People are less concerned with being American than party members. We have people in the street. I was just accosted last night in the movie theater. I went to see The Batman. By the way, wonderful movie, fantastic job. I was not so convinced this was going to be a good movie. I liked the special effects. I wasn't sure they had chosen a good actor for the lead role, but congratulations on a fantastic movie. It was wonderful. However, as we were leaving the theater, or getting ready to leave the theater, watching for the end credit scene, my friend and I were accosted by an individual who started spouting off Republican doctrined speech about how the coronavirus was artificially created by the Chinese and they're going to get off scot-free, how the Democrats, the American government lied, controlled by the Democrats, lied to the American people about how to protect themselves from the virus. Ladies and gentlemen, the coronavirus had several predecessors, and they were all tactile-based viruses. They landed on surfaces, people touched those surfaces, and they contracted the virus. No one was aware for months that it was airborne. They did not understand it was airborne until they tried to do what were called contact traces, saying, okay, if it's a tactile-based virus, then individuals have to come in contact with one person, and we find with patient zero, and that patient zero will be the person who touches other people or shakes their hands or whatever method of contact, and that's how they get the virus. They started finding people who were testing for the virus with no clear chain of contact to previous individuals who had been infected. It was only then they realized that it was actually an airborne virus that was actually staying alive in the air after it left its host. It took us months of discovery to realize this. Somehow, this Republican ideology, proposed and promoted by people in the Trump side of the Republican Party, who are all about misinformation and dissemination of information that's just completely untrue, in order to lend divisiveness and jealousies and everything else that Washington warned about. And this misinformation has become very difficult and very damaging because you get attacked in the public by people who believe these untruths. And I've studied the actual science of it. I've read the scientific documents. I've read the information that comes from both independent scientists and from the World Health Organization. And I was part of the reading and understanding how this virus was transmitted from the early days of the virus. So when someone comes up and starts attacking me because I don't hold to their beliefs, and I'm saying, look, this is not the truth. The truth is we didn't know. And once we did know, the appropriate information was passed around. To say that we didn't know and somehow that everybody knew from day one what this virus was because it had been artificially engineered is just fallacy. It's what are considered conspiracy theories versus actual conspiracies. And once again, I did an entire podcast on the subject of conspiracy theories and the difference between legal conspiracies and conspiracy theories. Because conspiracies are, for the point of this one issue, they are real. They are legal issues, entities. They don't just exist in theories of lizard people actually running the government or of dimensional entities coming into our world to impregnate children and create super race. Regardless of whatever, I guess those are actual real conspiracy theories, ladies and gentlemen. I didn't make those up. So yeah, the idea comes in that I can be accosted in a public place, not because of the truth or misinformation so much as it's a party political line. To become a Republican, you believe what the Republicans tell you. You adhere to the party line. You adhere to whatever the political agenda is that's spouted. When I get accosted by somebody who's talking about the misinformation about the coronavirus, about the vaccines, about whatever, it's a politically motivated attack. It's a politically motivated misinformation campaign. It's propaganda. And it's created by this very structure. George Washington predicted that this is what was going to happen. And again, he was not wrong. He specifically said that people who were less than honest, who were immoral, not his words exactly, but essentially could gain control of government, and through this control of government could turn government to their own individual whims, to get to empower themselves. Party politics, as I said, have left Americans fractured and divided. The United States just fended off an insurrection on January 6th, 2021. And arguably it was incited by our president, Donald Trump, in an effort to spread disinformation, to spread hate, jealousies, rise up this falsehood of his propaganda. He was encouraging masses of hate groups and people who were dissatisfied with the electoral results, that he had lost the election, spreading misinformation about massive fraud controlled by the Democrats, controlled by the other party, the other side, had created somehow a massive fraud, that he was the rightful president, and that they should go fight to preserve it. January 6, 2021 was the day that the Congress, under the Constitution, would read and formally accept the electoral votes of the individual states and officially name the next president. That election occurred in November 2020, with Joe Biden being the one who was elected. Donald Trump, in a desperate attempt to hold on to power, spread information that there was massive cover-ups, that there was tampering, he was calling people around. He's recorded on phone conversations calling the Secretary of State of Georgia to find him votes so he could claim the state. He had his people going around and filing lawsuits across the country trying to claim that the results of the election should be thrown out because of massive fraud. None of the claims ever amounted to anything in any of the courts, but before both Trump appointed, Clinton appointed, Bush appointed, Obama appointed judges. It didn't matter what political party, whether they were conservative leaning or liberal leaning. The truth is, there was no cover-up, there was no anything, and yet that belief still persists. But with this misinformation, Donald Trump called for his supporters to come to Washington, D.C. to protest, and then encouraged them to fight. His words, to fight to keep the false election, his false election, from happening. And they tried to overrun Congress. They killed 6 people. They killed 6 people in the process, both in people who were killed on sight and people that died from the injuries sustained. And suicides. People actually, there were I think there were 2 of the officers actually committed suicide, if I remember right. Well, either one, I know one did. It might have been 2. But the point is, people rose up in the name of Donald Trump to overturn what was considered a false election, ran through the halls of Congress, threatening to hang Nancy Pelosi, who was and they erected an actual gallows in front of the Congress. They actually erected a hanging noose. They were going to bring people out, congressional members out, Democrats out, and hang them. There were people threatening to hang and murder the vice president, who was in charge of reading all the votes, because Donald Trump told them that Mike Pence, the vice president of the United States, could overturn the election by choosing not to accept the electoral results. No such power existed. Every constitutional scholar, legal expert has said no power existed. And Mike Pence did the right thing. He oversaw it. They had to stop when the insurrection was going on. But once the insurrection was quelled, they returned and they did their jobs. They did their duty. But the insurrection happened, and it happened because of party politics, divisions and divisiveness created by these very insecurities that Washington warned us about. He specifically warned that riots and insurrections were a consequence of political party, our party politics. He warned against it. He said it in his own words. We just lived through one. Crowds of angered supporters, incited by Donald Trump, incited by people who supported Donald Trump, brought on by the false claims of the election fraud, stormed Congress in Washington, D.C. on January 6, 2021 in an attempt to stop the certification of Joe Biden becoming president. They tried to interfere and stop the peaceful transition of American power. This was most definitely a Republican Party push against the Democratic Party. This is party politics. And once again, let me reiterate, this is not legal under the Constitution of the United States. This was no part. The framers did not want this. George Washington warned against it. And yet here we are, 200 years later, and we're still doing the exact same thing. All this happened because Donald Trump, President of the United States, Donald Trump, weaponized the Republican Party. He played with discrimination, distrust, hate to challenge the election results. It's not the only thing he challenged, obviously. It's not the only time he used misinformation. He did through his entire presidency. But this is the one that affects what we're talking about today. Trump himself escaped impeachment twice. The only president of the United States impeached twice. He escaped it, not because he was judged to be not doing the wrong thing. And the subjects of the actual impeachments I'm going to avoid because, we obviously are talking about the latter of the two, but I don't want to get into it because it would really create a far too broad scope. The impeachments, the aspects of what they were about, I'd have to go back and talk about Clinton's impeachment and previous impeachments and historically, and that's a subject for another podcast because it would really eat into the time. Well, let's just say this. He did not escape impeachment because he was judged to have not done something wrong. He escaped impeachment because his party controlled one of the chambers of Congress. We had the House of Representatives, which was controlled by the Democrats, and we had the Senate, which was controlled by the majority of Republicans. As a consequence of the Republicans controlling the Senate, Donald Trump was exonerated from the impeachment. The House of Representatives drafted 2 formal letters of impeachment against Donald Trump. And in both cases, his party defended him. The votes were along party lines. The Democrats almost universally voting for impeachment. The Republicans almost universally voting to exonerate the president. So the Democrats knew there was no chance the Republicans would ever condemn one of their own. And that's the issue. They would not condemn one of their own. They would not. The House of Representatives was Democratic. The Senate was Republican controlled. They would have to work in coordination to impeach a president. If one party is controlling either chamber, they are not going to impeach a member of their own party. It's not about the loyalty to America. It's not about their duty as a congressman. It's not about their citizenship or their answering to their constituents. It's about protecting their party because their loyalty goes first to their party. That's the core of party politics. That's what George Washington warned about. This is not because Donald Trump did not do impeachable acts, but because his party controlled the Senate, and the vast majority of congressmen voted along party lines. In our so-called great social experiment that is our liberal democracy, elected officials are required by the Constitution to represent the will of people. They take an oath to defend the country and the Constitution when they take office. In the case of federal agencies, in fact, this is the congressional oath right here. In the case of federal agencies, they actually specifically swear to uphold the United States Constitution. This is the oath that congressmen take every 2 years. You have the entire House of Representatives and 1/3 of the Senate take this oath. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that I will bear true faith and allegiance to the same, that I take this obligation freely without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and that I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office on which I am about to enter, so help me God. Now, anybody who knows me realizes I have a problem with that last line. We are supposed to have separation of powers, but we're also supposed to have a government that's not influenced by religion. The separation of church and state is a core factor of our country. And yet, things such as Christian faith imbue our government in many respects. They take oaths swearing to God. We have "in God we trust" on our dollar bills, when we are actually a country that's supposed to be a freedom of religion. There are no Hindus represented in the language of our country. There's no Buddhists. There's no anything. There's certainly no atheists represented by these. When you take an oath to God, and yet here we are. There's no "so help me God" or Allah or interchangeable. It's God, Christian dominated. As a consequence, and so I'm not going to get distracted too much along that. So that's the one aspect of that I disagree with, and only because we're supposed to have a separation of church and state. And other oaths across the country are similar in scope and language, about supporting the Constitution, about standing up for the laws, and to do their duty in the office in which they swear to take. Where in that oath does it say I shall defend my party? I shall protect all members of my party from consequence and persecution. Where does it say that I will defend the leader of our party from any consequence of his actions, so long as we hold a majority in whichever chamber we control? It doesn't, because that's not part of their oath. They don't take an oath to the Republican Party. They don't take an oath to the Democratic Party. They don't take an oath to Allah. They don't take an oath to Buddha. They take an oath to defend the Constitution and to defend it against all threats, foreign and domestic. Well, excuse me, but Democrats and Republicans represent a domestic terrorist threat in the United States. All party politics do. And what happened on January 6th is a manifestation of that. Yes, it was a Republican-dominated uprising. But that doesn't mean the Democrats are not just as equally capable of accomplishing the same thing with the right person at the helm. Or, in this case, the wrong person at the helm. When every congressman voted along party line, regardless of whether they are doing it for an impeachment, passing a law, voting for or to ratify a treaty, or they are trying to vote to put somebody in a position like a judge, and they vote along party lines, they're not doing their job. They're breaking their oath. Every single time they vote because of the party affiliation and not because of the truth and the elements that are at hand. When they are no longer defending the citizens of the country. They are defending their parties, and they are defending their parties above the government and above the citizens they're supposed to be represented for. Whether it's to condemn or exonerate Trump of impeachment, whether it's to pass a law, regardless, they break that oath. Every single time they vote along party lines, they're breaking that oath. And in effect, they commit treason, because they are breaking the Constitution. They are defying the Constitution. They are upholding a policy and a practice that is not allowed for under the Constitution. They are committing treason against the United States every single time they decide to vote with their party rather than vote on the issue. Every time they forget that they represent the people of this country and not an extra existential, I can't even get the right word out. When they represent an organization that is extraneous to the government itself, they are not representing their office, they are not doing their duty under the Constitution, they are not defending their country, and they are committing treason. Now to be clear, and I just want to be upfront on this, I believe Trump should have been impeached in both instances. That's not because I think that, I think that he's a horrible person. I warned against him from before he was elected. When I first started hearing some of the rhetoric he was throwing around, it sounded very Nazi. It scared me because people seem to forget that Adolf Hitler did not take the German government by force. He did not mount an army and overthrow the government. He was elected. He was chosen after mounting the very same kind of hate campaign that Trump mounted to get elected. I saw the warning signs at the very beginning. And when he did what he did to be impeached, and I heard the information, and I heard the details, and I heard the facts, I believed he should have been impeached in both instances. My belief, based on the information. I'm not going to go into the details of discussions of the impeachments and what the elements were, because that could be an entirely new podcast all by itself. And it'd be way too far off topic to delve into. These podcasts tend to go about an hour. I'd probably end up with about 2 hours. I'd do a double episode just to bring impeachments into this. But keep in mind, I also thought Joe Biden should have been impeached over the Afghanistan withdrawal. And that wasn't something that was publicized a whole lot. I mean, yeah, the Republicans called him out for how sloppily he did it. They ignored the fact, of course, that this was created by Donald Trump himself, and the fact that the Senate never ratified the treaty, which is required by the Constitution, by the way, meant that it wasn't a legally binding treaty. It should never have been enforced. It should never have been entered into. It was not followed. The Constitution was not adhered to. Which meant Joe Biden should have withdrawn immediately from that agreement because it was not a legally binding contract or a treaty upon the United States. And yet, I mean, hey, Donald Trump withdrew from the Paris Accords. Why couldn't Joe Biden, and that was a legally ratified treaty, by the way. Why could Joe Biden not withdraw from the Afghanistan treaty, recognizing what was going on? When Trump freed all the Taliban prisoners, gave them all their money back, gave them all their power base back, and then sat back and started watching the Taliban gather in force and start moving against the Afghanistan government, who we were allies with, he should have been impeached. He should have been kicked out of office. That was way above the line. That put American lives at jeopardy. That put American interests, that put American allies at harm, and it actually destroyed an American ally. Where we're supposed to be honoring our allegiances and our allies in mutual support, we sat back and we empowered an enemy force to overthrow one of our allies. And then Joe Biden, rather than throwing out the treaty because it wasn't even legal, he sat back and did what Donald Trump basically had already set in motion. Technically what happened was Biden carried out this treaty. It was entered into by the Trump administration, with a group of people that was not even a government, did not have any input or consideration by the government of the territory in which he was entering this into. Did not even bring the Afghanistan government to the table. Did not bring the Afghan government involved in any manner, shape, or form. Made a treaty knowing full well the Taliban would overthrow the legally, democratically elected government that was in place. It had no lawful authority. It had not been approved by the Senate. Article 2 of the Federal Constitution, Article 2, Section 2 of our United States Constitution reads, "The President shall have the power, by and with the advice and consent of the Senate, to make treaties, provided 2/3 of the senators present concur." There was no effort to ratify this treaty, no effort to ratify this at all. And it wasn't even with a legally organized group. Even the title of the document says, which the United States does not recognize as a proper country. Trump never sought counsel of the Senate, much less received a 2/3 vote of the Senate to ratify the treaty. The treaty was unlawful, it was unconstitutional, and it should have been unenforceable. By all rights, when Biden carried it out, and believe me, the consequences were horrific. When Biden carried it out, he should have been impeached for enforcing an illegal treaty. Yet because his party controlled the House. Now, keep in mind, just as a side note here, the irony here would be that if he had actually been impeached, if the Republicans had been control of the House and the Senate, and he had been impeached, they would actually be impeaching him for something that Donald Trump did and he just simply went along with. But nevertheless, he did go along with it. If you rob a bank and you're just driving the getaway car, you're still part of that robbing the bank. You went along with it. Even if you didn't consent to it, even if you were just driving your friend to the bank and he says, wait here, I'm going to go in the bank for a minute. Comes out, quick, 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 run, run. They're coming after me. He's got a gun in his hand, he's got a bag full of cash, and you get in that car and you drive him away. You're still complicit in the crime. You're the getaway driver. Joe Biden was the getaway driver for Trump's treaty that was illegal and unconstitutional. But because his party controlled the House of Representatives, where letters of impeachment start, and technically right now they also control the Senate, there was no way an impeachment would ever get drawn up. And under the Constitution, letters of impeachment are drawn up in the House of Representatives, and they are carried across to the Senate where a trial happens. And the Senate decides whether or not to actually act on the impeachment. The House was controlled by the Democrats when they brought the impeachment against Donald Trump, who was a Republican. The Republicans controlled the Senate. And they voted to exonerate Trump because they control the Senate. The bottom line is that no party will ever impeach one of their own. The House will not impeach Biden unless the Republicans take control. Ironically enough, as I said, they would be impeaching Biden for his own, for the actions of Trump, for enforcing a treaty that Trump did. But nevertheless, he still committed the acts. He still acted upon a treaty that was unlawful and unconstitutional. He had the power to withdraw from. He should have been impeached, in my humble opinion. And this is the problem with party politics. Members of government are not loyal to the country. They are loyal to the party first and foremost. Republicans are loyal to Republicans. Democrats are loyal to Democrats. They are not loyal to America. They are not loyal to the government. They are not loyal to the citizens of the country. They are loyal first and foremost to their party. Then they're loyal to the lobbyists who give them the money to, who represent these big companies and everybody else, and the people who contribute massive millions and billions to their political campaigns. So, yeah, but their loyalty to the citizens of the United States is much lower on the totem pole. Their loyalty to the government certainly is, because they will defend their party before they defend the Constitution, before they defend the citizens, before they defend the government itself. Donald Trump incited a riot against the United States of America, and his party sheltered him from being impeached. You can't get much more against the Constitution than trying to overthrow the Constitution. And yet, he wasn't impeached because the Republicans controlled one of the houses, or one of the chambers of Congress. And therefore, no foul. If any aligned party controls the chamber of Congress, no president will ever be impeached. And this is true on a national scale, regardless of what level you have. You're never going to have Republicans working against Republicans. You're never going to have Democrats working against Democrats. I've said it for a long time. You can't leave the foxes to guard against the foxes eating the chickens, because they're just going to sit back and help the foxes eat the chickens. They're going to divide the spoils and share them. It's what I talk about the Great Montana Conspiracy all the time. You can't have corrupt officials guard against other corrupt officials. You need to have oversight that's independent of those government people. Democrats are never going to hold Democrats accountable. Republicans are never going to hold Republicans accountable, because guess what? They're loyal to their parties. Donald Trump introduced this wonderful concept called rhino. Republican in name only. Republicans who did not go along his party line the way he felt it should be were called rhinos. They're only Republicans in name only. Don't support them. Don't back them. He actually campaigns against other Republicans because they don't adhere to his policies. He's basically, at one point there was talk he was actually going to create his own political party, which would have drawn a huge chunk away from the Republicans' party, because a good 60-70% of the Republican Party backed Trump. Even to this day, even after all he's done, they still believe his lies. And they're documented lies. It's not even a question of maybe he lied. They're documented. And again, we can sit here and we can talk about Donald Trump and everything he's done. And we can talk about all the things that Joe Biden has done and has not done. And we can sit here and talk about how messed up our political leaders are. But the bottom line is that politicians are no longer loyalty to the constituents or to the government they work for. They are loyal to their parties above all else. And this divisiveness has sowed seeds of discord and hatred into the American people. And it has become very manifest in our current modern times. Quoting George Washington in his great words of wisdom, "Cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men revel in the power they glean from this abusive control of government." They do. There's no denying it. The real problem is that acceptance of a broken model empowers corrupt organizations to exist as well. Because citizens accept their government will work against their interests. They just automatically assume it. They know. Democrats are going to be loyal to Democrats, Republicans are going to be loyal to Republicans, and we're all going to sit here and bash our heads and smash against each other because we have different ideas and agendas, because our parties have different ideas and agendas. But as with Knudsen and his attack on the two-seated judges, he hides his real objectives. By speaking under a Republican banner, he can deflect from the real issues. He deflects away from the actual constitutional challenge that is the independent judiciary that Mike McGrath wants and thinks he's running. Remember, his office represents the legislature against the Montana Supreme Court in the United States Supreme Court. His office is not only well informed, he should be attacking the entire court. He should be saying, look, we have 7 justices here who sign powers to take power away from another branch of government. And this is a problem. But no, he decided to attack 2 people who were running for re-election at a Republican fundraiser. By deflecting his attentions and to attack these 2 specific judges, he avoids exposing the Great Montana Conspiracy. All because people have come to accept the party political framework as it exists. When elected and appointed officials are not required to be held accountable to represent their constituents, when they're allowed to hold allegiances outside their job, outside their duties, outside their offices, and they can hold those allegiances above their duties and their offices, you end up with an elitist government. You end up with one group of people controlling. And then when you want to hide the existence of corruption, regardless of what your party politics are, you just go ahead and start talking about party politics and hide what you're really apt to. And that's how you have corruption. That's how you have coexistence. In Montana, Republicans or Democrats aside, it doesn't matter what party you're under, you're still loyal to the corrupt system as it exists, which means you have an additional loyalty besides your party politics. You have an all-new party that's unnamed. It becomes the Great Montana Conspiracy. And because the Great Montana Conspiracy can hide behind the smokescreen of party politics as usual, people just don't see it. And if they're not seeing it, they can't change it. Thanks again for listening. I do hope that this video was enlightening, empowering. I hope you will like and subscribe it. If you're watching this on YouTube, that's certainly the method by which you can do it there. Regardless of platform, do like and share it. Subscribe to whatever channel you need to, or if you have that capacity on whatever platform. As always, you will find information in a text attached to this video. If you do not see that text, it's probably not an authentic reproduction of this podcast, which I don't have a problem with, by the way, but I do want you to make sure you're fully informed. So please take the time to visit us on monspiracy.podbean.com to make sure that you get whatever text might be attached to this video. And if you wish to support our cause, that's where the information will be. Now, as always, as I end these videos, especially in our trying times, and I spoke about the coronavirus earlier and I talked about some limitations and issues of it, please be safe. And whenever possible, please be free. Thank you.